Michael Vick once again finds himself in a bit of trouble. Hi, I'm Amber Wilson for CBS SportsLine. And Tuesday, a federal grand jury indicted the Atlanta Falcons quarterback on charges of sponsoring a dogfighting operation. And to explain what all of this means, we bring in our CBS SportsLine legal contributor, Clay Travis, to answer some questions. Clay, what are the details of this indictment? What kind of case are we looking at here?
Well, it's interesting. What we've got is the federal government has brought conspiracy charges against Vick. He's facing some very serious charges, but what's interesting about the 18-page indictment is that right now the federal government is trying to prove a conspiracy, which is typically the easiest case to prove for prosecutors. It's funny, when I was in law school, my criminal law professor used to say that there was always this idea among defense attorneys that prosecutors sit around and when they can't figure out how to prove anything else, they say, oh, we'll get them with a conspiracy. In this case, the 18-page indictment actually points out a lot of overt acts and actual events themselves that would lead one to believe that there could be further charges forthcoming. In regards to what a conspiracy is, basically it's an easy thing to prove because all it requires is an agreement between two or more people to carry out an act which is unlawful and some sort of intent to carry out that act. They have actual actions taking place in this 18-page indictment, but all they're trying to prove is the intent to act. So theoretically, Vick and his three indicted co-conspirators, the government's not going to have a huge obstacle to overcome to try and convict them.
All right, and you mentioned the three other co-conspirators. Obviously, those individuals aren't as high profile as Mike Vick is. How would something like that affect this case and the fact that this case is a federal case as opposed to a state case?
Well, when you dive in here, first of all, any defense attorney will tell you you don't want to be a defendant in a federal government case like this. You don't want to be the feds after you because they have the money, they have the material, and they have the mental firepower to go after you in a way that most state governments, quite frankly, don't. So this is the equivalent, it's like the New York Yankees of legal defense teams. I mean, they have everybody that you could possibly want. And what's interesting about it from perspective of the four indicted co-conspirators is that clearly the federal government's going to be going after Michael Vick. So those other three guys who are going to be indicted, presumably his friends, his business associates, whatever you want to call them, I don't know what the exact relationship between them is, they're going to be throwing all sorts of intimations about what they would be willing to do if one of those guys were willing to flip and testify against Vick and his other co-defendants. What's also interesting is all four would be on trial theoretically at the same time because the state would want to, the federal government would want to do a joint trial. So you got all four of these guys, three of whom are not big targets, and Michael Vick, who the federal government's going to be going after because they want to try to set him an example of him in a similar way that Martha Stewart or some of the CEOs who've recently been prosecuted have been, examples for the society at large.
Someone who's been acting as his own judge, jury, and executioner, the NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell, has suspended the likes of Pac-Man Jones, Tank Johnson, and Chris Henry this offseason due to violations of the Personal Conduct Code. How will that play out in this case with Michael Vick?
Well, I've been going after the personal conduct policy for a while, ever since Pac-Man Jones was suspended before he was convicted of any crime. What we have now is, a mess, quite frankly. We have Pac-Man Jones, who has been suspended for 10 games, potentially for the entire year, by Commissioner Goodell, without having actually been convicted of any crime. And now we're going to face the same sort of issue with Michael Vick. Now, right now, the NFL is saying they want the justice system to apply its course, and we'll wait and see what the actual facts of the situation are before they act. And they're basing that on some language that allows Goodell to punish people who've been involved in more than one offense. They're considering this Michael Vick's first offense because he hasn't been arrested, he hasn't been convicted of any crime. What's going to be difficult about the NFL making that case is that this indictment, this 18-page indictment, alleged events that occurred over the course of 6 years. These are not one, DUI incident. This is not one bar fight. This is a continuing and ongoing allegation of criminal, dogfighting ring that's been going on for a long time. So the argument that this is a first offense is really going to be difficult to hold up. The other thing that's interesting, I think, is that Goodell has really painted himself into a corner by suggesting that he can penalize people before the criminal justice system has acted. The most recent sports criminal justice story that was in the headlines was the Duke lacrosse case. If the exact same situation were translated to the NFL, probably Goodell would have been forced to act and would have tried to suspend those guys. My contention, and one that I think the NFL should consider in their own personal conduct policy, is a flatline rule that we don't suspend people before the justice system acts. because that's going to save an awful lot of trouble and keep the NFL from trying to split hairs in their legal defense and their legal analysis, which, quite frankly, the way that they're set up now, they're going to have to do a ton of with Michael Vick.
Will it come down to a status issue? Good players like Pac-Man Jones and Tank Johnson versus a marquee player, certainly the face of the Falcons franchise, Michael Vick?
I think that's the danger. I mean, it's easy to penalize a guy like Pac-Man Jones because he doesn't necessarily have a very large rooting interest, and he's clearly put himself in position to be involved in a lot of bad situations. But he hasn't been convicted of any crime. Vick hasn't been convicted of any crime, but these allegations against him are every bit as serious, if not more so, than anything that Pac-Man Jones or Tank Johnson or Chris Henry, for that matter, have faced. Now, what's going to happen, I don't really know. I mean, I think that's the key. I mean, we've got ourselves a situation that is really going to be playing out over the course of this football season, and the NFL is intimately wedded with whatever Michael Vick does. I mean, the question is going to be asked, is there a rule for superstars in the NFL different than the rule for regular players? And, in the NFL where the idea is, on any given Sunday, any man can have to step up, and each man is only as good as, his 10 partners on the field at the same time as he is. That's going to be an interesting question to ask. Is there a superstar code to the personal conduct policy? And I think, Goodell's gotten a lot of support from the NFL players so far, but if they start to think that the amount of star wattage they bring to the equation is going to change the way they're treated by the punishment and by the personal conduct policy, then I think a lot of that legitimacy can start to crumble. And I think that's part of the problem with the NFL's personal conduct policy as it's being applied right now.
And in a legal sense, what can we expect next from the Michael Vick camp?
From Michael Vick's camp, well, he's going to be charged. He'll have an opportunity to post bail. The camp would probably try to, as much as possible. It's interesting. Right now, he's probably retained lawyers. What's interesting to me is that these three co-defendants are not going to be able to have the same legal firepower that Michael Vick is. I mean, how is that going to play itself out? Vick is going to have a multi-million-dollar legal team. What's tough for Michael Vick is he's being charged along with three other men who are probably not going to have the same access and resources to criminal defense attorneys that Michael Vick is going to have. And like I said, the federal government is going to be going after those three other co-defendants with an awful lot of persuasion to suggest that they want them to flip. Usually you want the defense team is going to try to drag this thing out with the idea that, witnesses' stories can change, that things can play out that would be beneficial to the defense team. What's going to be difficult is, as we move along further, this conspiracy charge, one reason that prosecutors like to have the conspiracy charge is because it allows them to admit hearsay rules regarding the actual statements between the co-conspirators in a way that aren't typically admitted in court proceedings, and that's also one reason why convictions are easier to get. What's going to play out from here? I honestly can't tell you, other than the fact that we're in for a long road, and if I were Michael Vick, I'd be very nervous about what my three co-defendants were interested in doing. Again, he's only been alleged to have committed a crime, but you don't want to be going toe-to-toe with the federal government over any issue, and especially not a conspiracy with an 18-page indictment that they have that suggests they have a lot of facts that they can use to prove that you've committed a crime.
All right, thanks, Clay. We'll talk to you later. Keep your mouse clicking right here on CBSSportsLine.com for the latest on the Michael Vick case and everything in the world of sports. I'm Amber Wilson.